important factor that we've found out about forgetting is Ebbinghaus. He is a psychologist and studied the idea of forgetting and came up with this curve. And you should be familiar with what this curve looks like. You might be asked at some point to identify it. But the gist of it is when, like if I gave you a list of 20 words to learn or 30 words to learn or whatever the list is, pretty much within the first day or two, you're going to forget a good chunk of that list, right? 40, 50, 60% of that list. However, the retention rate doesn't continue to drop at such a steep rate. Eventually, after a couple of days, basically it levels off, and once you've got it in your memory at that point, if you've remembered it for 3 days or 4 days or 5 days, chances are those things are going to stay then in your memory. You'll remember it for 10 days or 15 days or 20 days or so on and so forth. So basically this idea is that in the very beginning, if we're going to lose information, it's basically going to happen in the very beginning. There's a steep drop and then it levels off. And once we've retained that information after a few days, it's more likely to stay in our memory. So just familiarize yourself with how the curve looks. It kind of looks almost like an L. And then the name Ebbinghaus goes with it. So that would be one thing to remember. The other thing that can happen with memory, or basically a lack of memory, is this idea of retrieval failure. You really feel like you've studied it, you've rehearsed it, it has made its way into your long-term memory, but for some reason you can't get it out when you need it. And so there's a couple of types of retrieval failure. We're going to talk about interference first. And this is a tricky one. Sometimes people struggle with this. I actually use the acronym PORN, P-O-R-N, to help my students remember it, which is why I have those letters underlined there. But basically, there's two types of interference, proactive. And proactive interference means that old information interferes with remembering newly learned info. So proactive, old, proactive, old. And so for example, because that's kind of confusing, right? An example would be, let's say you just started dating someone new and you're trying to remember their phone number. So let's say it's not saved in your phone. So you go to type in that number, but your ex's number keeps popping into your head. That's an example of proactive interference because that old info, your ex's phone number, is interfering with the new info that you're trying to remember. So that's usually my go-to example for that. It's like when an ex's phone number is what you start to dial instead of your new significant other's phone number. It could also go the other way, though. Retroactive interference is when new information interferes with remembering old info. And so an example of this would be, like I have my social security number memorized. We'll just say that it's 1111111. And when my husband and I got married, I had to fill out all of these different paperwork, like when you buy a house or when you sign up for insurance, and you need everyone's social security numbers. So I had to memorize his social security number as well because it was just easier than like finding the card every time and writing it out. So now, sometimes when I have to fill out a form and it asks for my social, I find myself sometimes writing down his information. So his new information is interfering with me remembering my old information, which was my social security number. So basically, the new info clogs up my memory and interferes with the old. So basically, it's just the same way. It's just one way the old is interfering and one way the new is interfering. So like I said, I use the acronym PORN. It's usually just kind of an easy way to remember that proactive. We start with the old interfering with the new, and the retroactive is the new interfering with the old. Not all of the time, though, is old information and new information conflicting. There is something else called positive transfer, which is the little note I have at the bottom there. And basically, positive transfer is when old info helps us learn new info. So maybe you have a strategy or a pattern that you use to help you remember phone numbers or birth dates. And so then you can apply that strategy and that pattern to new information to help yourself remember it. So that's called positive transfer. That's a good thing. So retrieval failure is just one of the reasons why if I have something in my long-term memory, it might not make its way out when I need it, when I'm trying to dial my phone or write out my social security number. But it's not the only reason why I might not be able to retrieve information. Another example is different forms of amnesia may cause problems with retrieving or filing away information. So this has to do, again, with forgetting. So anterograde amnesia, AA, is our ability to remember new things becoming impaired. So basically, let's say I hit myself on the head and I damaged possibly my hippocampus, because you need to know that the hippocampus is partially one of the brain systems that is involved with kind of like clicking that save button. And so then from now on, that information isn't transferring. So it's basically like the save button is broken. So I don't remember things. They don't make their way into long-term storage. There's a problem there. And basically every day is like a new beginning, because I don't remember that yesterday I watched The Bachelor on TV. I could watch it again today because the episode would be new to me because I hadn't remembered seeing it before. If I met my sister's new boyfriend, every time I met him, it would be a new experience because my anterograde amnesia is not allowing me to form and save memories. So basically, like, you're like a blank slate every morning. You remember everything previous to the injury or to the stroke or whatever the problem was that caused it, but anything after that event is, you can't form that memory. And there is a little bit of a caveat to that. You still can learn new skills. So remember, if you remember last week, we talked about how there's different types of memory. There's declarative memories, which is like remembering what you did yesterday, remembering that you met someone new or watching a TV show. And then there's procedural memory, which has to do more with like skill-based things like riding a bike or playing an instrument that you're fluent at doing. And so those are still things that you could learn. And what's interesting about that is people with anterograde amnesia, maybe every single day you have them sit down at the piano and you teach them how to play a few scales and things like that. The next day they won't remember that. You'll say, do you know how to play the piano? They'll say, no, I've never played before. But if you set them down in front of it, their hands know how to do it. There's procedure there. And that's because the memory system involved with like skill-based and procedural things like that is separate from the memory system that's forming these declarative memories. And so they will have no memory of knowing how to play. They have the skill of playing the piano. So that's just an interesting little side note. Retrograde amnesia is more of what I guess you probably see on like TV shows and stuff, like someone's in a coma and then they wake up and they have no memory of who they are, right? They don't know their name. They don't know if they're married. They don't know anything about themselves. That's retrograde amnesia. You've lost all of your previous memories, but you're able to remember new things. So you'd remember like, oh yeah, I was in a coma and I woke up, but now I don't know who I am. So basically, they're the opposite of each other. One, you're losing new memories. The other, you're losing old memories. And so just kind of being able to keep track of that is sometimes a little bit tricky. I don't have any fancy mnemonics for that one. If you think of one, or if your teachers have told you one and you want to share it in the chat, that would be great, because I don't have any special acronyms or things to remember that by. So big things are interference and amnesia. Those are really big topics, and I think those are kind of tricky. So if you are unsure, throw a question in the chat, but otherwise I'm going to keep going forward. We can always come back if there are questions. Other just kind of more general ways that we may forget information, there's two things. Something is called source amnesia, and I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but maybe you feel like maybe you watched something on a TV show when you were a kid and it feels like it was really real to you. And then later on, you're like talking to your mom or something, and she's like, that didn't happen to us. That was on a TV show. And you could swear that it feels real and it felt vivid. But that's an example of source amnesia. Basically, you're not really sure where this memory has come from, and it might even be false. It might not have happened to you. And this relates to some of the stuff we talked about last week, because we talked last week about how memory is not like concrete, right? It changes over time, and it can be manipulated, and it can be false. And so source amnesia plays into that. It's kind of a false or misleading memory, and then we actually don't remember the real thing that happened. So it's kind of a form of forgetting. The other kind of type of forgetting can kind of cause us manipulation is the misinformation effect. And basically, these 2 cars are a good example of this. Let's see, or 4 cars, I guess. You saw a car accident, and a police officer comes to interview about what you saw. If the police officer says, "Can you describe to me the accident?" Maybe you describe what happens in the above picture where the cars are just a little bit dented. You know, the blue car and the red car hit a little bit, minor damage. But if the police officer said, how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? Then he's actually kind of not purposely manipulating your mind, but the fact that they use the word smashed or crashed or banged or something more violent sounding basically then might cause your memory to remember the event as being more violent or more powerful than it actually was, and you might describe it more like the picture on the bottom. And so that's one thing that like police officers get special training on, and other people, because we have to be really careful with how we talk to people about their memories, because they can be easily like manipulated. Again, I'm not saying like on purpose they're manipulated, but they can be changed, and they can alter our perception. And so especially when you're going to want someone to testify in court or things like that, you got to be careful. Freud, who we're going to learn a lot more about second semester, he's going to come up a lot in our personality unit, but he does talk a little bit about memory. And Freud would say that we could also be motivated to forget, so we actually forget on purpose a little bit. And he would call that repression. And basically, it's this idea, Freud, again, is all about like our inner selves protecting us. And so Freud would say, you know, if we had something traumatic happen to us in our childhood, or we have some sort of bad memory that could actually be harmful to us, we may actually block that or repress that memory so that we are protecting ourselves, basically. So now I can forget that trauma or that bad thing that happened because I've repressed it, and now I'm like healthier and safer. My mind is at ease and things like that. So it's motivated forgetting. And then he also talks a little bit about how memories are constructed, which goes back to what we talked about with source amnesia. And then the last person that we're going to talk about in regards to memory is Elizabeth Loftus, and she's pretty important. She's a more modern psychologist, and her studies are actually really fascinating. I don't know if you ever watch Brain Games in your classroom, but there's a really good episode. I'm trying to think what it's called. I think it's just called Don't Forget, or yeah, I think it's called Don't Forget. And she is featured on that episode, and it's really a good episode. And she talks about how basically our eyewitness testimony sucks. Her job originally was to provide assistance to defense attorneys, because basically, like back in the day, if someone, like if you were testifying in court and you said, I know for sure I saw this person commit this crime, it was like guilty, right? Lock them up, throw away the key. Eyewitness testimony is super reliable and super valid. But through her research, we're actually finding out that that's not the case. A lot of times, either through purposeful manipulation or on accident, people misremember events. And so when we put someone up on the stand to testify, they may fill in the blanks. Your brain actually does that, right? Instead of having a gap in your memory, your brain just sometimes takes a guess and fills in the blanks. So that's not super reliable. And if we're going to send people to jail for a really long time, we want to be certain that we're sending the right people to jail. And so she proved that it's actually possible to plant entirely false memories into people. And so we really have to be careful when we use eyewitness testimony in the court system. So if you're interested in like the criminal justice system and things like that, I would definitely look more into Elizabeth Loftus and her research, because it's pretty fascinating. It's pretty interesting. All right. So I believe, Yep, so we are kind of done with the forgetting part now. So if you have any lingering questions about why we forget or why we don't remember, you can throw them in the chat or in the Ask a Question box. But now I'm going to kind of move on to like the problem-solving thinking part of cognition. And so really cognition, which is what this whole unit is about, is just any sort of mental activity, so something like happening in my brain, right, associated with processing or understanding or remembering or communicating information. And basically the simplest way to put this is cognition is thinking. We all think, we all experience cognition. So it's pretty straightforward. But what we're going to focus on now is how we think differently and how we approach thinking, because there's different ways and different methods of understanding. So one thing that we do is we create concepts of things. And so a concept is basically our brain's shortcut. Like our brains do a lot of things, right? We might not be conscious of all the things that our brain is doing, but there's so many things going on in our brain that it likes to create shortcuts, and it allows us to think through things with less effort. So for example, we may have a concept of chair. Hang on one second. I apologize for this. My dog wanted to come in. Okay, get down. Good job. Sorry about that. So we create these concepts of things, which are these kind of broad umbrella categories of something. So for a chair, right, we have all of these different examples here. They all look a little different. They seem a little different, but they all have the same basic purpose, right? Like a chair is something you sit in. That's your concept. And basically, it just, if you describe something as chair, it takes less cognitive effort to think about. And that maybe seems like a simple example, right? Because how often do you really have to think about a chair? But we could use it for other things as well. Something that's hard to describe or hard to understand, like anger. Emotions are really hard to, like, if you think about it, put into words. But if we have a concept for anger and what that feels like and what that means, it becomes easier to understand when someone says they're angry. I don't need them to explain the like minutia of how they're feeling. I understand because I have that concept. So basically, it's just our brain's way of thinking through things easier. And so to develop a concept, we need a prototype. And basically the prototype is like our stereotypical best example of a concept. So when I think of chair, my prototype is like that first one, the upper left one with the kind of reddish brown wood and then like the blue seat. Like that's just like a typical chair to me. And so that's my best example or my prototype when someone says chair. That's what pops into my head. And typically, I would guess your prototypes are similar to that, some sort of chair. That doesn't mean that or the Chase Lounge aren't chairs, but those aren't, you know, like our stereotypical or our prototype example. And so if you think about your prototypes for different things, it tends to be something that's similar to like most things in the group. For example, if I told you to think of bird right now, think of your prototype of what a bird looks like. It's probably closer to a robin or a sparrow or a bird like that than it is to a penguin, right? Not a lot of people's prototype or best example of a bird is a penguin because they like waddle, they don't really fly, and they live where it's really cold, and most birds don't, and like the feathers and not feathers. So that doesn't mean a penguin is not a bird, but your prototype is probably of more of a general concept of like a robin or a sparrow or a crow or something more like that. And so as we drift further away from like our central prototype, sometimes our boundaries kind of blur between one example of something and another. So if I told you right now to think of your prototype of what a girl is, like a little girl, I always, for some reason, picture a little girl in pigtails, wearing like a little pink jumper and curly hair. That's my prototype of girl. And then I ask you to think about your prototype of woman. And maybe for me, I picture someone wearing high heels and like a pencil skirt and makeup and has like long hair that's curled. That's my prototype of woman. So as I drift further and further away from my prototype of girl, when do I reach my prototype of woman? Is a 16-year-old more similar to girl, or is a 16-year-old more similar to woman. And so basically, our prototypes are kind of helping us organize this info, but as we move further and further from what our best example is, sometimes the concepts can be confusing and a little bit misleading, because when is the cutoff for girl to woman? Is it 15? Is it 18? Is it 21? Like, where is that example? But our brain uses all of that information and helps us catch quickly, instead of me having to like talk through it all in my head like I just did for you guys, if that makes sense. So that's one way that our thinking works. That's how our brain functions, makes things more easy for us. Another thing is the different types of thinking, or the different ways that we can approach problem solving. I think these are pretty straightforward concepts, but I just wanted to mention them because they are mentioned in the books, and they're important because they do show up on tests. But convergent thinking is basically like when I'm giving you an AP Psych test, right? Your teacher gives you a test with multiple choice questions on it. You have to come up with the right solution. That's convergent thinking. You take all of the answers and you narrow it down to a singular solution. You take all the facts, all the information, and you come up with one right solution. On the other hand, we have divergent thinking. That would be like if your physics teacher gives you some sort of problem to solve, and you can solve it in any way you want. You have to brainstorm all these different ideas that you could use physics and mechanics and things to come up with a solution. So there might not be one right answer. There could be 10 answers or 20 answers, or limitless answers of how to approach the problem. And so we use these in different ways, obviously. So on a lot of tests, you're asked to do more of the convergent tasks. You need to find the correct answer. So you're using your logic and your critical thinking skills and your analytical skills, things like that. But with divergent thinking, you're using creativity and your imagination, and you're coming up and brainstorming all kinds of solutions. So there's a purpose and place for both of them. But basically, I think if you know what the word converge means or what the word diverge means, you basically get what that is. So hopefully that's not too confusing. All right. Other things that are just mentioned as problem-solving strategies. So basically, it's like, I put this problem in front of you. How are you going to solve it? And one example of this is trial and error. So I don't know how many of you have like younger siblings, but if you've seen those, like what this kid here in the picture is playing with, where it's like there's different shaped holes, and then they have to find the little like plastic pieces that fit in the shape. So the star goes in the star, the circle goes in the circle. And like little kids, right, they don't get the like thinking behind it. A lot of times they're just like hitting it and trying to fit something in a hole that doesn't fit. But that's an example of trial and error. A little kid doesn't understand that a circle and a square don't match up. So they just start hitting the circle into different slots until all of a sudden the solution presents itself and the circle fits in the circle and it goes through. Another example of this would be, maybe you're trying to make your grandma's banana bread and you forgot the recipe. And so you kind of know what's in it. There's bananas in it, there's flour in it, there's sugar in it. And so you just start trying to bake different loaves, and eventually you make a loaf that tastes right. And you're like, oh, this is it. I need 2 cups of flour, a cup of sugar, whatever. And so that's trial and error. You just try things until something works. Not the best maybe problem solving strategy if you don't have like a starting point, but it does work, right? If you have the time to sit through it and do it, it works. Another strategy, and I always kind of, I don't know that I would actually call this a strategy. They call it a strategy in like textbooks and stuff, but it's basically just your aha moment. Like you've been puzzling over something, like maybe a brain teaser or something for a while. And so I do have a brain teaser here. So if you actually know the answer, you can type it in the chat. What word can you pair with all 3 of those words? So it's the same word, to make a compound word out of all 3. So think about that for a second. Throw it in the chat if you know it. But basically, it's like you just have to think about it, and eventually the answer pops into your head. There's no real strategy there. You're just kind of thinking about it, and then eventually you have that aha moment. The light bulb pops on, and you've solved the problem. This type of thinking is done primarily in our frontal lobes and in our right temporal lobe. Because it's kind of, I don't want to say creative thinking, but it's not necessarily using that like straight logic type thinking. And so, for example, maybe right now one of you is experiencing this aha moment, but one of the words that works is stop. So there's backstop, shortstop, and stopwatch would be a word that fits with all three of them. And again, there was really no strategy to that. You just had to be kind of thinking about it, and maybe that light bulb would pop on for you. Another word that works with them is hand, backhand, shorthand, watch hand, although I don't know if that's a compound word, but I would have accepted it. So that's your insight. There are other more, how do I want to say it, reliable strategies that we can also use to assist us in problem solving. And so one of those is an algorithm. And algorithms are great because it's a step-by-step procedure that will guarantee you a solution. You use algorithms a lot in math class, right? If you use a step-by-step formula, like the quadratic equation, you will get the right answer if you do everything correctly. So that's an algorithm. You are going to eventually solve the problem. However, it can be time-consuming and tedious. So if I put that those letters there, SPLOYOCHYG, in front of you and told you to use an algorithm to solve it, there are 907,200 different solutions or different ways that those letters could be combined. Eventually, you would unscramble it and make it into a word, but it could take you 907,200 different tries. So yes, it's a step-by-step procedure. It guarantees a solution, but it's time-consuming. And so what those letters unscrambled is actually psychology. I've seen that in textbooks, so maybe you saw that in your textbook. But basically, if you had no idea how to solve that, you could just switch one letter every single time, and eventually you would get psychology. Another good example of an algorithm, I don't know if you watch The Big Bang Theory, but I like to show some of their clips in class. And basically Sheldon thinks he's come up with the algorithm for friendship. And so he goes through this whole process. The chart is there, that picture is from the episode. But basically he wants to make a friend. And so he has an algorithm for first you place the phone call, then you ask this sort of question, and then you based on the answer, move on to this question, and so on and so forth. And eventually you end up with friendship. And so if you're interested, you could always Google the friendship algorithm and watch it. It's like a 2 or 3 minute video clip, but it's another good example of algorithms. So if we're in a hurry though, and we don't have time to do an algorithm, our brain often resorts to what we call heuristics. And heuristics are just little shortcuts that we can make in our decision making or in our thinking process that helps us get to the answer more quickly. So it is faster, but because we are using shortcuts, more errors. So there's like a pro-con, right? Algorithms are great because you're always going to get the right answer, but they can take a long time. Heuristics are great because if you're in a hurry, it can help you get the answer more quickly, but you're bound to make more mistakes that way. So it's kind of, cost-benefit analysis there. And so our brain is really sneaky, and it uses heuristics all the time, even if we don't know that we're using them. So for example, we use those scrambled letters again that spell psychology. If I had placed that in front of you and asked you to solve it, you maybe would have started by putting the CH together, because when there's a CH in a word, they often go together and make the ch sound, right? So that's a heuristic. You might not think it's a heuristic, but you're using a shortcut. You're using your prior knowledge to basically come up with a quicker solution. You also might notice that there's 2 Y's in the word psychology. And I don't know of a single word in the English language that has Y's that go together. So you could basically skip all of the combinations of letters that put the 2 Y's together, because it's just not how words in the English language function. So basically, those are little shortcuts that you might use in order to problem solve more quickly instead of doing the algorithm for solving the whole thing. And there are 2 types of heuristics, and you need to know both of these. This is kind of important. And basically, it's just 2 different types of shortcuts that we use when we're thinking. The representativeness heuristic is basically judging how likely things are in terms of how they match our prototypes. So let's think of your prototype for a professor. My prototype of a professor is someone who wears a tweed jacket. Maybe they smoke a pipe. Maybe they're an older male. That's just my prototype of professor. That's what I'm thinking of right now. And so that's kind of like figure A there. We'll say A is like our professor prototype. And then figure B might be our truck driver prototype. Maybe we picture our truck driver wearing like a cutoff flannel shirt, wearing a hat, maybe smoking a cigarette, maybe having tattoos, things like that. That might be your prototype of what a truck driver looks like. And so studies have shown that when we use our prototypes in representative heuristics, that we might actually ignore other relevant or important information. And so this study that they did was they created a fictional town called, I don't know, Portland. I don't know what it was. They made up a fictional town, Portland. And in Portland, 90% of the population is truck drivers, and 10% of this made-up population are professors. And so they told the participants this, 90% of the town is truck drivers, 10% is professors. And then they gave little descriptions of everybody in the town. And you had to say, well, is this person a truck driver or is this person a professor? And so 90% of the people are truck drivers. However, a lot of the people that they're describing sound an awful lot to you like your prototype of professor. So you're like, oh, wears a tweed jacket, must be a professor. Oh, smokes a pipe, must be a professor. Oh, likes to read foreign literature, must be a professor. And so you end up ranking all of these people as professors. It's like 50-50. Even though in your head, you knew the information ahead of time that 90% of the town is supposed to be a truck driver. And so you ignored that relevant info, the 90-10 split of truck drivers and professors, and you went too much based on your prototype or your stereotype of what those are. So that's an example of how we can often make mistakes, I guess, sort of in our decision making when we rely too much on our prototypes and not enough on the given information around us. The availability heuristic then is similar. It can cause us to make mistakes, but it's in a different way or for a different reason. The availability heuristic basically is us estimating the likelihood of an event based on how readily we remember certain events. So if something is really vivid in our memories and it easily pops to mind, we might think it's more common than it actually is. And so a good example of this is pictured here with the shark example. A lot of people are afraid to go in the ocean. They're afraid to swim because of sharks. Because anytime there's a shark attack, what happens? It's all over the news. It's like, oh my gosh, this person's leg got bit or their arm got bit. They had to close the beach down. And there's all these movies about sharks like Jaws and Sharknado and I don't know. There's just a ton, Megalodon or whatever that last movie that just came out was. There's tons of movies about sharks eating people, right, in the ocean. And so like when you're going to the ocean, that kind of pops up. It's a vivid example in your head, even though shark attacks are incredibly rare. And so basically the availability heuristic can kind of cause us to play off of our emotions and not actually think through the logic of like, well, there's only like worldwide, like what, 5 or 6 shark attacks. I don't know, I'm making this statistic up, but it's super, super rare. The statistics are rare that you would get bit by a shark. In fact, more people die every year from vending machines than they do from shark attacks. So with that information, you'd be better off like being super cautious walking past a vending machine than you would going in the ocean. But we don't hear about people dying from a vending machine tipping over on them, but we do hear about people being eaten by sharks. And so that's why that pops to mind, even though it's super, super rare and probably not something we have to worry about. Yes, there's always a chance it could happen, but the statistics say that it's pretty unlikely and pretty rare. All right. And so now we've got just a couple more slides left. We're going to talk about other kind of problems or things that prevent us from being accurate in solving problems. So again, if you have any questions, this is the last time I'm going to throw this out there. If there's something else that you want to cover at the very end or a question that you need me to come back to, throw it in the chat or throw it in the ask a question, because once I finish these next, I think there's 3 slides left. That's going to be the end unless we have other things to talk about. So let me know. But okay, so why might I have problem solving or obstacles in my problem solving? Well, as humans, we tend to like to be right. Our brains don't like to be told that we're wrong. And so a lot of times we have this idea called confirmation bias, where we really, when we're trying to problem solve, are actually just looking for information that validates what we think. And so you might even do that with research. You're researching the effects of violent video games. And because you think that violent video games cause violence, you search in a way that is going to give you results that match your opinion. And so like this little cartoon here shows is, oh, I've heard the rhetoric from both sides. I'm going to do my own research. And then you do your little Googling, and basically you find the first link that agrees with you, and you click on it, and you're like, yeah, I am right. Look at that. This website agrees with me. I must be right. And so basically you just find information that supports what you think, and you ignore information that might say that you're wrong. And that can obviously create problems or obstacles to problem solving, because you might be ignoring valid or other important information. And so then it leads you to making an incorrect or a wrong decision. Fixation is basically just your inability to like think about a problem from a new perspective. I know sometimes when I'm trying to like brainstorm a new idea for an FRQ question, sometimes I get so caught up in the old one that I used to ask that it's like I can't approach it from a new perspective. You just get fixated on the old way of doing something, the old way of thinking about something, that you can't like turn the problem around and think about it from a new way. And if you can't approach the problem in a new way, you probably won't come up with a solution to it because you're stuck on the old stuff. Sometimes that happens when we're trying to like solve a brain teaser or something, and then all of a sudden someone else comes up and they have a new way of thinking about it, and then all of a sudden the solution becomes clear because they're approaching it in a different way. Other obstacles to problem solving, functional fixedness. I always do a demo with my students. I just go around my room and I give them different, like I have like a little mirror. I have a little UW Badgers football helmet. I have what is it called? An ice scraper for my car. And I give those things to my students. And I said, all right, you have 30 seconds or a minute. Brainstorm as many different ways that I can use this object besides like what it's actually intended to be used for. And that's an example of breaking out of functional fixedness, is brainstorming new and unique ways of approaching a problem. Let's say you are trying to take apart something that's screwed together because you need to get what's inside of it, and you don't have a screwdriver. Well, if you can get past or beyond your functional fixedness, you might remember that a dime is really small, and maybe I can use that dime in those crevices to unscrew the screw there, and I can get past my functional fixedness and think of new ways to approach the problem, basically. Or maybe I can get past my way of thinking, and yes, this little ice scraper could be used for scraping my car with ice, but maybe I could also use it for a pointer in my classroom to point at different things. Those are just examples of breaking out of your functional fixedness. Anchoring bias is another example of having problems with problem solving. But basically it's when you just focus too much on one specific aspect of a decision. So if you're buying a new car and the only thing you can think about is the odometer, like how many miles are on it, even though this car has a completely brand new engine and it's been repainted and it only has one owner, but you're just so obsessed with the mileage on it that it causes you to like look past all of the other good things about it and maybe make a not so great decision. I had a problem with this when we were first buying our house. We were house hunting, and like walls that were painted like weird colors really threw me off. Like you'd see this house and you'd be like, oh, it's got a big yard, a nice kitchen, but gosh, look at that bright orange wall over there. Like that's so ugly. And even though like that's super easy to change, right? You buy a bucket of paint and you paint over it. Even though that's really easy to change, sometimes it was hard to get like past that in your head. And so maybe we passed up on a really great house because the anchoring bias, I was so like focused or drawn back by that one aspect, I didn't think of all the other good things about that house. And then lastly, our mental set. I don't know if any of you have looked at the matches yet. I'm sure you have. It says, how would you arrange 6 matches to form 4 equilateral triangles? Well, your mental set might be preventing you from solving this problem. First of all, you can't break any of the matches, so they have to stay all in one piece. But basically, to solve this problem or to get past your mental set, you have to basically think of new ways to approach a problem. Sometimes we have a tendency to think about something in a particular way because it's been successful for us in the past, but that can predispose us to thinking in a certain way. So for example, if you haven't seen this brain teaser before, you're probably thinking right now how to lay these matches down and make 4 equilateral triangles, and you're having a really hard time because it's not possible. But if you put the matches and make like a 3D model of the matches, then you can make 4 equilateral triangles if you prop them up. And so basically you have to get past that mental set, that thinking approach of like typically like if you have to arrange things, you want them laying flat on a surface, right? And so your predisposition to thinking about that problem in that way would lead you to not be able to actually solve the problem. So you have to think outside the box. Basically, the mental set is like breaking outside of the box and thinking about something in a new or different way. And lastly, I'm pretty sure this is the last slide, overconfidence can get in the way of our decision and judgment. And I think overconfidence often ties to like confirmation bias, where like we think we're right, so I don't need to look at any other outside information. I'm confident that I am correct. And so why would I need to listen to someone else's opinion or someone else's judgment when I know I'm right? Because I'm always right. And so that overconfidence can lead us to make some bad decisions. This can also happen, got cut off here, but after a test, we have a lot of confidence and a lot of swagger. We think we did so great. And then we see our multiple choice test score and we're like, oh gosh, maybe I should have studied more. Maybe I should have spent more time looking over my answers. But basically, right, if we're too confident, we might not make the best decisions, and that's not good. I can also manipulate you. Advertisers can also manipulate you in the way they frame things. So basically, it's like how we ask the question. So for example, how fast were the cars going when the accident occurred? Or how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other? How I word that question frames how you think about it and how you answer it. It affects our decision making, it affects our thinking, it affects our judgment, but it also can be used by advertisers, right? If you were to buy ground beef, if you're at the grocery store and one hunk of ground beef said 25% fat, you're like, ugh, that's gross. 25% fat, that sounds nasty. Or another one next to it is labeled as 75% lean. You're like, oh, that's great. 75% lean. That sounds so healthy. That sounds so good. You're more likely to buy that. They're the exact same thing, but how that issue is framed or presented is going to predispose you to think about it in a certain way. And then lastly is our belief perseverance. This is a big one, and I think we see this a lot today with people arguing politics. I don't know if you're on like Facebook and Twitter and things like that, but basically even when you show someone information that refutes what they think, their belief, they don't change their mind. They're so set on being right that I could show you all the facts and all the figures and all the research about something, but you're like, nope, that's wrong, that's fake. I'm right, you're wrong, that sort of idea. And so this little cartoon here is a good example of that. It's like, I would say, 2 judges talking about a case, and it says, I'm happy to say that my final judgment of the case is consistent with my prejudgment of the case. So sometimes we make a snap judgment about something, and then no matter what evidence or what testimony or what facts and figures we see, our brains don't like to change our minds because we don't like to be wrong. Like our brains don't like to be wrong. And so psychologically speaking, sometimes we will ignore, even when we're presented in the face of like data and facts and studies and figures, we will ignore that and just go along thinking that we are right and everybody else is wrong. And so obviously, if you're thinking that way, you might make some bad decisions or bad judgment based on those beliefs.